Hey everybody, Ben here from DMC Films and Cineblock Studios, and a few years ago when I made this video, I screwed up quite a bit. So this is, again, everything you need to know about acrylic paints in less than 12 minutes. 12 minutes? Are you joking? I'm sorry, I couldn't do it any shorter than that. There's a lot to talk about. So what are acrylics really, and how do they differ from oil paints or watercolor paints? Paint made for artists is made with three main ingredients: pigment, binder, and stabilizer. In acrylic paint, you're going to see a pigment, whether that be natural or synthetic, a stabilizer to keep the paint held together to make sure it doesn't sort of fall apart or separate, and of course the binder, which gives paint its specific name, such as oil, where you have linseed oil, or walnut oil, or alkyd oil, or in acrylics, it's an acrylic polymer binder. So when you head on down to your local art store, or maybe an arts and crafts store, depending on what you have in your area, you're going to see all the paints. Oils, acrylics, watercolors, and then you're going to see subsections of all of those paints. Student, artist, and professional grade. What is the difference? As much as I like to bash on student grade paint and tell people how terrible it is, if you're just starting out in acrylics, go ahead and get it, because it's going to be your sort of introduction to the medium where you learn color theory and you're just sort of playing around and experimenting with it. Outside of doing that though, I don't really recommend it, and here's a few reasons why. Even if the paint isn't labeled as student grade, what you're going to find is that if all the paint colors are exactly the same price, like it's say $5 for all of the paint colors regardless of pigments or whatever, that's probably student grade paint. Aside from being cheaper, your student grade acrylics aren't going to have the same kind of coverage that an artist or professional grade color would. Essentially, the same amount of paint won't go as far. Student grade paint also has additional fillers in it, and oftentimes additional water to kind of take that price point down a little bit, but unfortunately it also takes the quality of the paint down a little bit. In addition to this sort of downgrading of the paint, you're also going to see less what we call tint strength. And this is basically how potent the color is. So you may have a black, but it might be more transparent. You're going to have to put several layers on it to actually get it to be that sort of dark, potent color that it needs to be, while a more professional grade paint, you're not going to have that problem. So let's talk about those artist and professional grade acrylics now. You know, the ones that actually matter. So when talking about artists and professional grade acrylics, there's two main things you really want to focus in on: your viscosity and your pigments. Now we've already talked a little bit about pigments, so let's keep talking about them. So the higher quality paint you get, you're going to start seeing differences in both color names and what pigments they are. So in a student grade paint, you might see something that just says green or emerald green, and that's nice, but it doesn't really help you in knowing what color it is. If you're familiar with a larger artist catalog, or if you've just been to an art store and saw all the different colors you have to choose from, you might think, okay, what do I choose and what works, and what's the difference between all these pigments? Well, the first step in knowing this is both experience and just trying different colors of paint, and the second step to it is learning to read what's on the back of your paint tube. Today, for example, we're looking at two different greens: Hooker's Green Hue and Phthalo Green Blue Shade. Now the biggest thing to note to start is the difference between a pure pigment and a hue. So when mixing with a paint that has a pure pigment, it's going to have the same consistent color regardless of how you're mixing it, where you're mixing it, whether you're mixing with mediums or what. And this, for example, Phthalo Green is Phthalo Green Pigment PG7, and that's listed on the back along with things like viscosity. A lot of times it says light fastness, which is if the color is going to fade or not over time, as well as if it's transparent, semi-transparent, or opaque. My other green is Hooker's Green Hue. Now, what is the difference between Hooker's Green and Hooker's Green Hue? A hue is essentially a mix of pigments that usually don't contain the actual name. So in Hooker's Green Hue, there's no actual Hooker's Green, it's actually a mix of pigments. The same cautionary tale of color mixing also goes with hue paints in general. Because hue paints are a mix of colors and not a single pure pigment, they're going to mix a little bit differently, and maybe not the same way that you'd expect a simple, say, green and black or green and white to mix if you were just doing it with a pure pigment paint. I know that a lot of that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but to put simply, just kind of watch out when you're picking your colors. So most paints, especially when talking about artists and professional grade acrylics, are going to be what they call heavy body, and that's what we call viscosity. So what is viscosity in terms of paint, and why does it matter? Now when it comes to paint, there are 5 main viscosities. There are inks, fluids or liquids, soft body, medium body, and heavy body. And as you may have already guessed, it's sort of a range from thin to thick. Acrylic inks have a very thin fluid viscosity and are great for people who want to do sort of detailed graphic work, especially for those using a dip pen. Liquid and fluid acrylics are really great when you want to work either on canvas or even on paper, mainly because they work on a variety of surfaces and have a great area of coverage. You can use less paint and really spread that a lot further, particularly if you're using a liquid or fluid artist or professional grade acrylic. Consistency, you're looking at something like a heavy cream or sort of a sugar syrup. It's not exactly water, it's got a little bit of thickness to it, and it's pretty good. This stuff's raspberry flavored. Soft body paint, obviously the next step up, is going to have a little more volume to it, and it's still going to be sort of a little bit flowy and moving around a lot more. If you have tried student grade acrylics, these are usually soft or medium body paints. So yeah, if your student grade paint is a little thicker, then it's not going to just run all over the place. If you squirt it out of the tube and it doesn't sort of level itself, that's probably a medium body paint. And finally, there's heavy body paints. Now this stuff is thick, and I mean thick, like creamy peanut butter thick. This stuff is dense. Now, some artists don't really care for heavy body because it's thick. It's thick, it doesn't spread quite as much as, say, like a liquid or a soft body. But at the same time, you can make a heavy body paint thinner by adding water, by adding acrylic glazing liquid, and you won't lose the integrity and intensity of that paint in the process. My sort of rule of thumb for this is I love heavy body because you can make it thinner, but you can't really make a thinner paint thicker unless you have the use of a medium. Okay, I keep talking about acrylic mediums, so you might at this point be asking yourself, alright Ben, what are they? Acrylic mediums are split up into two main categories, gels and pastes. Both the gels and pastes are roughly non-pigmented, they're either white or clear, and they change the texture and variety of things you can do acrylics with. Essentially, you're changing the workability of acrylics. You can take a thick, heavy body paint and make it thin like a fluid or an ink. Or you can take an ink or a fluid and make it thick like a heavy body. Doing this in either direction, though, will often change the drying time, either speed it up or slow it down. If you take nothing else away, though, from the difference between gels and pastes, remember that pastes dry opaque, and gels dry either translucent or transparent. Okay, we've talked about the paint itself, so let's talk about brushes, palettes, and canvas real quick. In an art or craft store, brushes are usually labeled for the mediums that they're best with. Oils, acrylics, watercolors, they all work for acrylics. Don't believe the hype over everything. But in general, oil and acrylic brushes kind of work well together. If you can't afford brushes though, don't be afraid to get a little creative. You know, rubber, foam, shapers for color, use your fingers if you really have to, sponges, just frickin' anything, man. If you're not planning on mixing your paint right on the canvas or paper that you happen to be working on, which I don't recommend usually in most circumstances, you're gonna need some kind of a palette. You can use really whatever you want here. They sell palette paper that's just sort of a little flimsy, kind of like a wax paper you use for baking or something like that. Other popular choices are plastic and wood. You're probably going to find these in your local art store. Personally though, I go on a little more of an alternative route. I use a pane of glass because you can scrape it clean with a razor blade when you're done and reuse it infinitely. It's a lot cheaper that way and they pretty much last forever. Unless of course you step on one. Alright, let's talk about the stuff you really do care about now. The pros and cons of acrylic paint. Acrylics are versatile, fairly easy to work with. They're much cheaper than oils, there's no messy cleanup, and you can paint on really any textured surface. On the downside though, acrylics are a fairly permanent medium. If it dries into your clothes, it's not coming out. Acrylics also dry fairly quickly, which some people might say is a con, which I'm using it here for one, but it's also technically a pro because I don't like paint that takes too long to dry. Additionally, because acrylics have a shorter drying time, some people say that they are harder to blend. Now it is possible, and sometimes you want to use the help of a medium such as acrylic glazing liquid. Personally, it works well with water. If you just do it by experience, it is possible to blend with acrylics. So at this point, you might be looking to buy some paint, or you already have some. So you might be thinking, okay, what brands are good, and which ones do I want to avoid? For your basic student grade paint, any of these will work just fine. Personally, I'm not a fan of the Liquitex Basics, but if you're just starting out, they're not that bad for paint. When you want to get a little more advanced though, you're thinking artists and professional grade paint, I definitely recommend one of these. particularly golden, but any of those will work. Now for those paint companies you probably want to avoid. First off, System 3, which I think is made by another company name that I either don't know or can't pronounce. The biggest reasons here is that the consistency is terrible, the pigment load is pretty bad, so it doesn't have great tint strength, and I've noticed that a lot of the colors are kind of transparent, which is not really useful. Another one to avoid is Winsor & Newton's Galleria paints. Now this may come to a bit of a surprise for some of you who know a little bit about paint already, is that Winsor & Newton actually make a really nice professional / artist grade paint. They've been calling their stuff professional lately. It is technically still artist grade paint, they just changed the name. But their Galleria line is just in that same sort of category of System 3, is that it has a really sort of terrible consistency. And in having that bad consistency, it also doesn't cover really well. The coverage is just, it's pretty poor, especially if you start working on larger and larger canvases. You're going to notice that you're using a lot more paint to cover a smaller area. And finally, the last one you want to avoid at all costs is any craft paint! This is the one thing that drives me absolutely insane, is people who call themselves acrylic painters, but they use the little craft paint in the bottles. This is not acrylic paint, even sort of a little bit. I mean, it is, yeah, technically made with a little bit of that acrylic polymer, but it'll either wash out your clothes, it usually has a poor, inconsistent consistency. I don't like this stuff, it's horrible, and when I meet artists that use it and use it seriously, I want to slap them upside the head, because it is just really terrible paint. So you, the viewer, don't use it. Please, just don't use it. And especially, don't mix it with a higher quality paint or an acrylic medium. That's just, oh. So whether you're new to acrylic paints, or like me, you've been using them for years, if you learned anything in this video, go ahead and hit that like button, and let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. And as always, subscribe for more art videos like this one. This has been from DMC Films and Center Block Studios. See you guys next time.